Meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. Uh, Jason, you had suggested that we add some activities from the config group and maybe merge the groups. Can you speak about that for a moment?
Sure. So at this point, but not all of the work that the config group and the UX group are tracking and discussing are very similar. So analyze kind of straddles this border, although it falls more in the UX group. Status, some things with APIs you could argue could fall into either group. So this is all a duplication, and a lot of the same people show up to both meetings. So it might make sense to focus our efforts in one area. There's probably a lot of the config stuff could be tracked by UX. There's probably some things that would fall into another working group's domain. So things more along the API machinery and galley would probably be a better fit for like the networking control plane group. That's less of a UX issue compared to the API shape, API design, guidance, etc.
It sounds good to me, and it means less meetings for people, so I am greatly in favor of that. Would you want to be sort of a UX lead, or what's your thought on that?
I think in the short term, it would. I'd like to help in the transition because there's things that the config group has tracked before, so I'd be happy to help there. And if being a lead is the means to do that, sure. And then we can reevaluate it, in a few months.
Okay, it sounds great. I'm going to see what we can do to get it set up, and I just encourage people from the config group to start putting agenda items on UX.
So I don't know if you have talked to Lynn about this, but what would probably be good is to come up with just a kind of a short proposal for what we just talked about and what it might look like, and then bring it up with the DOC just to make sure everybody's on the same page. And if they have any other suggestions, because there might be some other things to consider, like the API review process itself. That kind of was part of the config working group charter at one point, and the TOC is kind of responsible for that. So like, maybe we can have a proposal for like how we think that should work, whether or not we actually are the ones to do it, or we have some other suggestions. I feel like we also need to track that.
The API review was mostly test and release, right? Like if you look at the API in the API repo, two reviewers are required, one from test release and one from TOC. So the config group mostly are just in charge of kind of the API machinery and how API, like give instructions to APIs and the tooling around.
Right. So maybe we just have to clarify how that works in this new model.
Okay, that sounds great. I will write something up and get that on the TOC calendar. So for today, we have two agenda items. The Eric Gannon from Google is going to be talking about the user experience research. Small item best apply if we have time for it after the Eric Gannon's findings. Does anyone have anything else? Great. Eric and Mitch, can you share screens and make stuff happen?
Yeah, I can share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to present just briefly a few slides. I've presented this to the Google team already, but some precursors to some potential competitive research that we have in mind around the Istio and Linkerd install experiences. So basically summarizing what Mitch and the team did to try and immerse ourselves into the install experiences ourselves before we put this in front of other users who aren't familiar with it. So for some context, this project basically arose after we had some feedback that the Istio install was more complex and more time consuming than the Linkerd install. So we wanted to go in and experience that ourselves. So we narrowed to 2 tasks, enabling telemetry and MTLS. And we did this from sort of a brownfield perspective where we had a cluster running on GKE and already had the Hipster app installed. So what does that migration sort of scenario look like was one of the questions. So for Linkerd, the steps are linked here, but that just goes to their getting started page. These were done as group sessions. Both the telemetry and MTLS tasks could be done from that getting started page. Istio, we did this during 1.3, so a few things have changed since we did this, these empathy sessions. But these were done using individual friction logs. So an engineer that was new to the team documented his process trying to do the install and what the sticking points were and what was hard to use about it. And at the time, there was not really a comparable step for MTLS in Istio. So we are holding off on that until the next step where we can do some further research on it. We used the operator install instructions and the Istio cuddle, so some feedback on both. Just to give an idea of the pages we looked at in terms of content, this just shows kind of the differences in the structure of the pages. So the Istio cuddle has a lot more content on the page, mainly because there are a lot of optional steps and alternatives to completing the same tasks, where Linkerd and the operator instructions were a little more straightforward. And we looked at those because they potentially had more instructions for the existing app scenario or something we could extrapolate from. Getting into the findings from the friction logs, the install was not successful using the operator instructions. So a few things contributed to this. The first thing that he encountered was a lack of clarity, especially around the prerequisites at the beginning, where they just kind of sent him off to more documentation. There was a lot more to read, a lot more overhead before he could even get started on anything. So some kind of checklist or some command that would check those things for you would be ideal. There weren't guidelines for when a specific profile was most appropriate, so there were different options for installing different profiles, but it wasn't clear to him when he would use one over the other. Steps without any kind of expected output made it unclear whether it was working as intended. So there were times when there was some guesswork because he wasn't sure if what he saw was really what should be there. Along the same lines, manual steps really that should be automatic. So there were times when he was looking for all the services to show up and had to count on his fingers to make sure that it was the same number of services as he saw in the instructions. And then the docs weren't clear about what to do in a case where not all the services are showing up. So he experienced that where some were missing and he wasn't sure if he messed up somewhere or if it just wasn't installing properly. He also saw errors that printed even when the command was successful. So he thought the command failed because he got an error, when really this should have been some kind of warning or something a little bit less severe. And then there wasn't a clear confirmation step when the install was complete. So he actually kind of stopped and restarted more than once because there wasn't really an ending step to tell him, okay, this is done and this is how you know that it's done. Similar things happened for the Istio cuddle experience, but he was able to get it installed with the help of another team member. So a few enduring points here across both the operator and the Istio cuddle docs was that they consistently assumed that we were starting from a clean slate. So we wanted to approach it with this app installed already just to see what that migration scenario would be like and whether the docs were equipped for that. And there was a lot of guesswork created because of that, because the docs don't have explicit instructions for that scenario, it seemed. So it really kind of remains to be seen whether someone who's brand new to this could take what's already there and know that these are the docs for them if they have an app running already. So that's something we're going to explore in the next phase of the research. On the other hand, the Linkerd process went well for the group sessions. They were impressed, especially with the integration of the dashboard for Linkerd. The instructions were more succinct. It made it more digestible because it kind of broke it up and gave them a nice visual of what they'd already done. And it served to be some confirmation for them as well, that the steps they had taken were resulting in some action and they could see that it was behaving as they expected. Like I mentioned before, both the telemetry and the MTLS tasks were completed here because it's done automatically in Linkerd. That wasn't the case for Istio at the time. We didn't do a formal friction log here, but a few of the issues they encountered in Linkerd were around terminology. For example, edges was kind of an unclear, unfamiliar term. They didn't provide a lot of context for some of the terminology or a glossary or anything that was very apparent to us. There were certain steps that were time intensive. It was unclear if it was paused or if it was stalled or what the next step was because there weren't really good error messaging. And they didn't appear to support strict mode or multi-cluster. A few recommendations to come out of this. To start off with, I think the organization of the pages could be improved, especially just highlighting what the purpose and the differentiators between each install experience could be a lot clearer. The engineer that created the friction logs for these mentioned that he wasn't even sure how some of the installs were different from the others and whether he was even on the right page for his use case. A guide up front too that kind of helps users through navigation items would be helpful. So which options would apply to them the most, especially like the Istio Cuddle page here where it was really long. There were a lot of optional alternative steps. So if we can focus those at the top with descriptions of those, that might help with easier navigation and less overhead for the users to go through and read each of these and figure out the difference themselves. This is an example of what I'm talking about. This is from the Cloud Functions page. So this is basically just an example of consolidating kind of alternate experiences for the same goal, where these are all the quick starts together in different languages and a little description of each one and how they're different and which might apply to you the most. Further recommendations, again, a confirmation step, especially guiding them to the dashboard of their services. For the Istio steps, it was more of kind of a tour of features and steps, and there wasn't really a nice like wow sort of at the end or something exciting that they could see things working. And that was a really interesting part of Linkerd's experience that differentiated it. The documentation should be clear for common use cases, especially with an existing app. So again, a lot of them just assumed you were starting from nothing. Including guidelines for checking prerequisites, language, especially on the automatic MTLS page, which is now released for people who are interested in that right away. So again, language just explicitly saying, if this is your scenario and you're migrating and you have an app already, here's how to do this with your app. Output of successful commands should be warnings rather than errors so that they know it still worked. Linkerd also had a section at the end of their page that addressed some caveats or known gaps, which was interesting. It might be worth looking into something similar for us, just to show users that we can anticipate some of the questions they might have or features they might be looking for at the end of a certain page, and we've already thought of it. Also, there are limited options for giving feedback in the docs. So something where we can invite that, especially in context, where users can report bugs or tell us when something's unclear or didn't work or didn't apply to them would be really helpful. Next steps on our side, we're going to conduct some more internal sessions, but with participants who are new to Istio, so outside of anyone that works on Istio. And we'll compare metrics like task success, time on task, ease of use, and some other subjective measures as well. So that's everything we did so far. Happy to take any questions.
I think this is great, Erin. I really thank you for preparing this slide for us.
Sure.
I'm hoping that you can, I recorded this and I'm going to be sending it to some people. I'm hoping you can send me a link to the slides as well, because I'd like to create issues for most or all of your recommendations.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I can send you the deck and some of the more detailed docs as well that has more explanation for some of the recommendations too.
And we should open up some more discussion about this. Even like the novice users, I've had difficulty understanding a lot of the options, like the difference between the profiles and under which circumstance I'd want them. So some of them already have work items, but this will hopefully get them some more attention. I'm hoping to hear from other people on the call, though. What do we think about what we've just seen?
Well, I mean, I think it's great. One observation is it seems like a lot of the areas for improvement are not actually in the code itself, but in just in our documentation, that we're kind of overwhelming users. So certainly, I mean, kind of in a lot of aspects, less is more.
Yeah, I'm going to be making sure Frank Badinsky watches the video, but and Frank, if you're watching it, hi. Yes, a lot of it was documentation, but maybe a lot of it we can solve more easily with code. I've also done the Linkerd install and been impressed by it.
Yeah, we've started to improve in some of these areas. I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't know if documentation is the number of options that we have and kind of the fundamental way we approach how things are structured. Always a bigger change that needs to be investigated.
So, I mean, for example, we created this istio verify install command, and it was supposed to be similar to a Linkerd check, but no one is aware of it because our documentation doesn't mention it and this kind of thing. So it's possible that some of the things can just be adding more text to the output of the manifest install command, manifest apply command, and that kind of thing.
So with the, I have one more question. So the users that were part of the study, are they coming at it from just having no application in mind or minimal or services, or is it, has there any research been done on like an enterprise user who's got a very, very large deployment, is onboarding with that in mind?
This is all we've done so far. So our start state was we had the Hipster app installed, and it was just Googlers doing this. I think for the next step, it'll be a similar start state. So we'll prepare that for them. But yeah, ideally, it will be people who have less experience with Istio, maybe aware of it, aware of the features. But we're trying to emulate as close as possible someone who would be in that enterprise scenario and who's new to it, but they're interested in these features like telemetry and MTLS. Another thing I should mention is for next steps, we have these recommendations. Some of these are lower hanging fruit, I think, potentially quicker fixes. We'd like to work on those ideally before we do further sessions. We're working with some people to tackle a little bit of that already in some of the documentation. So hopefully we can fix some of those and get it in a little bit better shape before we introduce this to newer users. For a full formal study, and then I can come back and present those results too once we do that.
The first bullet is a dashboard, and of course I put a dashboard in the command line that links to our 7 different dashboards. It's really nice how Linkerd has a single dashboard. I don't know if there's anything we can do to unify our dashboards. The friction logs, I've never used them. What did users have to do to sort of record their problems they were having?
Yeah, so those are templates that we use basically with sort of a coding system of as they go through the experience, they can detail the steps that they were taking and then highlighting, which were successes, which were failures, which things would I just quit if I wasn't working here, kind of thing. So It helps us just at a glance see which steps have the most to work on and the most need that the engineers do. So it was helpful in our case because we had an engineer who was new to the team and could go into it with, pretty blank slate. So he went in and created those to document basically all the steps he took, what he was confused by, and what things are, the most severe issues that we should fix right away.
Okay, great. Any other questions for Aaron? Well, thank you, Aaron. I hope you can return in a few months to see how we've improved all these things.
Yes, me too. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay. So I had one more item I wanted to mention for this group. So first off, if anyone knows how to re-enable permissions on the shared Google Drives, that would really help me because I couldn't access my UX folder this morning. One thing that I've been struggling with is part of this install verified process. When users install Istio with Istio Cuddle Manifest Apply, they often override things. There's a bunch of values that they can set, and first users don't know what they can set. There's a work item for that. But I want to present this item, which is not that. What I was hoping this was a simple request that we record what the user has specified when they did the manifest apply. I'm calling that a bill of materials, and I'm thinking that we have an Istio control plane resource that we're generating internally. Let's just write that to the cluster. Currently in Istio, if you use the operator, it's written to the cluster, but if you use the command line, it never gets persisted anywhere what was chosen when you set up Istio. Some things do, but your profile choice does not. The reason I wanted this was because we have the Istio Cuddle Verify Install, which I should have made bold here, and it requires you to type in the exact same options that you had done when you installed it, which is ridiculous. If we recorded it, later on you could install the operator and it would bring it back to your original state. Just seemed like an easy thing to do. It could also help you to list, if you had multiple control planes, sort of where they were. That's it. I'm not sure who really would be approving this. I talked with Steven from Environments. He couldn't make the thing. Hoping that we could talk about it here. Do we like this? Do we not like this?
The idea of not asking somebody a question that they've already answered makes a lot of sense. Fewer options would certainly help. I wonder about a question that referencing the profile name versus the set of options, which I guess there's tiers of options here. There's like the Istio control plane options that somebody would provide. That gets translated to some additional APIs in the profile itself. Do we track it all? Or do we track just the derived artifacts?
Right.
Verify against that?
Currently, what it does is some stuff gets done by things like the injector. Other stuff, like your profile, sort of never gets written. And maybe if it had some values in it, they get written, but your actual profile did not. And not knowing that makes it very hard to use it for the verify install, which is trying to redo the work and then see if all the stuff you created is still there. So right now it's hard to know exactly what is saved out there. Having a simple bill of materials as a Istio control plane seems awesome.
Well, Clay asked in chat, maybe you can clarify, Clay, is there a particular reason to install it to the cluster instead of a file, for example. So do you mean do you mean the options that somebody specified to store those in a local file?
Right. So first I want to point out that something that really surprised me was that the demo profile is stored as a Istio control plane, and it's tiny. It's just 200 bytes. But if you do istio file dump, you get a gigantic expanded control plane that is like 2 or 3K. So there's a lot of, so you don't really know what the sort of minimal description is. I was thinking, I first thought it would be great just to write this thing out to the local file system, and then the user could use it again. But then the question was, well, where should we write it? And if more than one person is ministering Istio, like there's a nighttime operator and a daytime operator, this kind of thing, is there a good place to store it? And my thought was, well, if you're installing Istio operator, you're already adding that CRD, you're already putting it on the cluster. Why not just go whole hog and make that ICP stored on the cluster? But you're right, there's no reason not to. And if you're doing it in like a pipeline, you might want to save it elsewhere because you're going to make the cluster later.
I think there's something to be said for making it easier to do that. This came up in multi-cluster as well, where we needed to transform config. In that case, persisting it was easier rather than just kind of dynamically applying it to the config as it was being applied. It seems like you'd want to push people in that direction, that what they're applying, that it's not some combination of YAML and set options. Ideally, it's just you have a fully declarative configuration for your cluster, and there's good tools to build and modify that full YAML.
Right, and so there sort of are. So you can do istio profile dump, and then you can do istio mesh. I believe you can apply and give it a file name or something. There is a way to do this with a file. And if anyone does that, that's awesome. But, and it's, so maybe we don't want to store this to the cluster. Maybe we just want to have it always, if you're doing manifest apply, have it make that to remind you. Or maybe we wanted, is too easy. They should always do the two-step thing that saves this local file. But I liked how it was a single file. I mean, a single command. It would be nice if it wrote a dot Istio profile to your home directory or put it in your cluster.
Yeah, I can see we have a CRD now for the Istio control plane. It would be nice if Istio manifest could take that as it does take it as input, but it would also generate it as output. And at that point, you can kind of mix and match. You can have everything in a file. You can apply it and use the operator. You can apply it and it exists in the cluster, but nobody's actually using it. But then maybe something like verify install could later check. But you don't need to persist it in the cluster.
I totally agree with the mix and match. Currently, the CRD for control plane is only installed if you install the operator. If you install base Istio, it doesn't get installed.
Yeah, it would be a prerequisite. If you want to install a new type, you need to define the new type.
Right. And so I don't know if people would resist installing an additional CRD that is only used to sort of describe Istio itself.
Yeah, I mean, you could reduce the number of options and say, if you're using the operator, everything's in cluster, and we do all these auto magic things for you. But if you're on kind of the CLI mode, you always have to provide a file, and you have those two paths.
Okay, so I'm happy to make this thing make a file in your local directory. I can change this proposal to record it locally, or maybe with an option to record it globally or record it in the cluster.
So if it's locally, what if you have different terminal or different machine that you're executing Istio CPL? would that show you the combined output?
So if you're doing it locally, do you mean you have multiple clusters or multiple profiles on a cluster?
Maybe just multiple clients that maybe you and I are operating are the admin. If I go on vacation, you do the administrative work on yours, right?
That's why I wanted to put it in the cluster, because I thought that was the easiest option. It adds a CRD that a user normally wouldn't get until they installed the Istio operator, and it adds 2K to the amount of config stored on the cluster, but it seemed really easy and problem-free to do it. So that was the reason I wrote this up in that way. I didn't even discuss the file option. The file option is on the work item. But to install Istio and then not remember how the user installed it seems like an anti-pattern.
What's the use case for that?
So the use
Somebody's
case
going into production and they're setting files and not committing anything, and it's keeping it on their local file system.
I think the use case is they don't know how to save it.
Yeah, me personally, it's like when I go through different Istio tasks, sometimes it tells me, hey, enable your mutual TLS. Hey, enable your auto TLS. Hey, let's enable this and this flag. So at the end, I actually lose track of what I applied. It's just so convenient if I can dump the state of my installation, that I actually know what I did. Imagine that's the work divided among multiple persons.
So would it, for example, be helpful if in all of our install guides, instead of just saying install with some additional options, we guide people to the path of having all of the customizations in one YAML, and then they apply that YAML.
Yeah.
In practice, that's what you'd want to do for production anyway.
So let me ask you a question about that, and this is maybe overly technical. If I look at like demo.yaml, I believe it is, this is the profile for the operator. It's pretty small. It just gives some memory sizes and some things that are sort of there. It's 115 lines, it's tiny. And I can easily understand this. And I can easily compare that to empty YAML, minimal YAML, these other profiles that come with it. But if I do the Istio Cuddle profile dump demo, I get this gigantic thing that includes what Zipkin hub I have. Is huge. I found it really confusing to have this giant file here. Which one do you think users want to store? One that is small and looks like this, customization, or
Right. Yeah. So
how are you recommending your customers do it?
I mean, I think this is an artifact of the profile mechanism. We want to have something called default that abstracts all of these options, and so we present it that way with the CRD. But then when you do a profile dump, we then immediately pull back the curtain and say, here's all the details that you didn't know about, and that's sort of
sorry, I thought you finished. I think most users were just interested in the delta. At least I would only be interested in the delta. The long one is not consumable to an extent.
if you search for that,
There's no way to, getting the delta out seems hard. There is that profile diff thing. I also made this work item to get a description of the profile, a human readable one, because I felt that there was no documentation that said things like, this profile includes Kiali or that kind of thing. I'm hearing some background noise.
And if on your board,
yeah, it's in the top right.
It's like
6469.
So the first thing I do is I download the computer driver.
Can you turn on mute if you're not talking to this work group?
Okay, so anyway, do we have any thoughts about this? I can rework it, but maybe we can continue discussing it on Slack or add some comments to this once I get it on Google Docs.
I think this area definitely needs to be improved, and there's some good ideas here. What might be helpful, particularly because the people that would implement this are, it spans quite a bit: documentation, environments, install. That maybe we identify some different specific use cases and say, okay, I'm a user. I want to do this. I start with the default install. Now I want to make a modification and view my change, and commit it to something, and maybe have a few cases that kind of summarize the different patterns that and the different problems that we're seeing, and then if you bring that to the environments group and say we need make this easier somehow, because there's certainly more than one way to structure it, as we just said. Sometimes you want to see all of the options, sometimes you don't. Maybe there's a case for both. I think that was Clay's point. I don't know. If we actually see what the user journeys are, it's you kind of just end up throwing everything in, and then we just have more complexity.
Okay, well, I can certainly add user stories to it. And hopefully they'll be very similar to some of the stuff Aaron was talking about earlier in terms of what people want to do. Like my inspiration for this was we have a command that's like linkerd check, the istio cuddle verify install, and it needs to know what options were picked, and currently it does not. So that's going to be the first story. How do I check that I installed Istio and it's still there? But I hear you. If it's two people installing Istio together, it's a different story than if one person's doing it.
Yeah, I can help you with the user case add because this is something I personally find pretty painful myself. I guess having the controller side operator kind of helped me solve that problem because I can always look at what I CPI apply and what are my status. But if I use the Istio CTL, I always can't really remember what I did unless I have a central YAML file that keep track of everything, which I don't. And that's also not what we tell people to use when they just learning Istio.
I have the same thing because I often install it with different options for testing, and then I forget what I installed it with. And part of the motivation for this was to make the command line experience more like the operator experience. So they're as close as possible. It'd be great to be able to install from the command line and then just drop the operator in and it picked up the options you had used 3 months ago.
Yeah, and I honestly, I think it's a little bit confusing that the Istio cuddle takes an operator file that it can process it, but then at the end, I can't dump out that file without having the access to the original file. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, well, I will. I ran this by Stephen, but I'll run it by the environment meeting in I guess in 8 days, and we can talk then. Do we have any more items for today? If not, please add agenda items for 2 weeks from now for the next UX meeting. And I think that's it. Anything else? Shall we finish up?
Is your session recorded? Sorry, I joined a little bit late for the UX researcher.
It is recorded, and sometimes I'm late. Like I didn't put on the recording for last month until yesterday, but I will put this on tomorrow when I get the recording file.
Okay, thank you so much, Ed. Thanks, everyone.
All right, bye, everyone.